Title: The Giant Currency Superstorm That Is Coming to the Shores of America When the Dollar Dies. Financial superstorms. And they're brewing, folks. And we're going to get into that Asian article. I believe it's actually from a Chinese newspaper a little bit later about the big happenings last week in Asia. But until we get there, we'll start with this here. By recklessly printing, borrowing, and spending money, our authorities are absolutely shredding confidence in the United States dollar. And this is the thing, folks. It's the rest of the world. It's not us. It's the rest of the world. And they are watching this nonsense. And at some point, they're going to give up on the U.S. dollar and throw their hands up in the air. And when that happens, it is going to be absolutely catastrophic for the United States economy. Right now, we export a lot of our inflation. Each year, we buy far more from the rest of the world than they buy from us. And so the rest of the world ends up with giant piles of U.S. dollars. This works out pretty well for them because the U.S. dollar is the primary reserve currency of the world and is used in international trade far more than any other currency. But back in 1999, the percentage of foreign exchange reserves in U.S. dollars peaked at 71%. And since then, it has slid back to 62.2%. But that is still an overwhelming amount. Foreign exchange reserves in U.S. dollars is around right now 62.2%. We can print, borrow, and spend like crazy because the rest of the world is there to soak up our excess dollars because they need them to trade with one another. But what will happen if the rest of the world decides to reject the U.S. dollar? At that point, we would see a tsunami of U.S. dollars come flooding back to this country. Just take a moment and think of the worst superstorm that you can possibly imagine, and then replace every drop of rain with a dollar bill. The giant currency superstorm that will eventually hit this nation will be far worse than that. Most Americans don't realize that there are far more dollars in use in the rest of the world than in the United States itself. A recent scholarly article by Linda Goldberg says that the dollar is a major form of cash currency around the world. The majority of dollar banknotes are estimated to be held outside the U.S. More than 70% of $100 notes and nearly 60% of $20 and $50 notes are held abroad, while two-thirds of all U.S. banknotes have been in circulation outside the country since 1990. So for decades, we've actually been exporting gigantic quantities of our currency. So what would happen if that process suddenly reversed and massive piles of dollars started coming back into the country? It's frightening to think about, isn't it? Well, I guess the key is to get the rest of the world to continue to have confidence in the U.S. dollar, so that'll never happen, right? Unfortunately, there are lots of signs that the rest of the world is accelerating their move away from the U.S. dollar. And this example I like to bring up to people is the BRICS countries. And it was recently actually announced that the BRICS countries are developing their own version of the World Bank. The BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they have begun planning their own development bank and a new bailout fund, which would be created by pooling together an estimated $240 billion in foreign exchange reserves, according to diplomatic sources. To get a sense of how significant the proposed fund would be, the fund would be larger than the combined gross domestic product of about 150 countries, according to Russia and India. Now, over the past few years, there have been a whole lot of new international currency agreements that encourage the use of national currencies over the U.S. dollar. Here's just a few examples. You have a deal between China and Germany, China and Russia, China and Brazil, China and Australia, China and Japan, India and Japan, Iran and Russia, China and Chile, China and the United Arab Emirates, China, Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, the BRICS nations. So you see, they're all making these deals here. They're either preparing for our dollar to die or are actively working to get away from the dollar because it's going to die. They see this, all those countries. Will this movement soon become a stampede away from the U.S. dollar? And that is a very important question. But you don't hear anything about this in our media, of course, and our politicians are not talking about it at all. Meanwhile, our leaders seem to be doing everything they can to destroy confidence in the U.S. dollar. The Federal Reserve is printing money like there is no tomorrow, and the federal government continues to run up trillion-dollar deficits year after year. They do not seem to understand that they are systematically destroying the U.S. financial system. Other world leaders get it, like Vladimir Putin, Russian president. He once said, quote, "Unreasonable expansion of the budget deficit, accumulation of the national debt are as destructive as an adventurous stock market game. During the time of the Soviet Union, the role of the state and economy was made absolute, which eventually led to the total non-competitiveness of the economy. That lesson cost us very dearly. I am sure no one would want history to repeat itself." Wow. Why can't most of our politicians see how destructive debt is? What the federal government continues to do is absolutely insane, friends. The national debt increased by more than $24 billion on the day after Thanksgiving this year. And that's another article I'm going to cover right after this. The national debt increased by more than $24 billion on Black Friday, or International Buy Nothing Day, or whatever you want to call it. It increased by $24 billion in one day. But utter disaster has not struck yet, and most Americans are not really that concerned about the debt, so things just keep rolling along. And of course, our national debt of $16,309,738,738,056,362.44 is apparently. So we have the actual liabilities of the federal government, including Social Security, Medicare, and federal employees' future retirement benefits, already exceeds $86.8 trillion, or 550% of our country's gross domestic product. For the year ending December 31st, 2012, the annual accrued expense of Medicare and Social Security was $7 trillion. Nothing like that figure is even used in calculating the deficit. In reality, the reported budget deficit is less than 1/5 of the more accurate figure. And that was an article right out of the Wall Street Journal. Now, other economists paint an even gloomier picture. According to economist Niall Ferguson, the U.S. government is facing future unfunded liabilities of $238 trillion. So where are we going to get all that money? Well, why don't we just print more money than ever before so that the U.S. government can borrow and spend more money than ever before, right? Don't laugh. That is actually what some of the top economists in this country are actually recommending. The most famous economic journalist in the entire country, Paul Krugman of the New York Times, is boldly proclaiming that the solution to all of our problems is to print, borrow, and spend a lot more money. He insists that there is no reason to fear that giant mountain of debt that we are accumulating, that there's no reason to fear that it will someday collapse our own system. So let's read what this propaganda master from the Ministry of Truth himself, let's see what he has to say. Mr. Paul Krugman of the New York Times. Quote, "For we have our own currency, and almost all of our debt, both private and public, is denominated in dollars. So our government, unlike the Greek government, literally can't run out of money. After all, it can print the stuff. So there's almost no risk that America will default on its debt. I'd say no risk at all if it weren't for the possibility that Republicans would once again try to hold the nation hostage over the debt ceiling." Ooh, gotta like that fake left-right paradigm he threw in there, huh, folks? But if the U.S. government prints money to pay its bills, won't that lead to inflation? No. Not if the economy is still depressed. Now, it's true that investors might start to expect higher inflation some years down the road. They might also push down the value of the dollar. Both of these things, however, would actually help rather than hurt the U.S. economy right now. Expected inflation would discourage corporations and families from sitting on cash, while a weaker dollar would make our exports more competitive. And that's from Minister of Propaganda Paul Krugman at the New York Times. And I don't know, just a bunch of, and you guys already know as well as I do, the smart people who read the newspapers, yeah, they read stuff like that, don't they? Oh, yes. We do need to discourage corporations and families from sitting on cash. Why discourage people from saving, right? we should discourage them from saving since they're forced to pay for Social Security benefits that they're not going to get when they get old enough. Right, Paul? Oh, man. Can see right through this guy, huh, folks? Too easy. Whatever. I'm not having it, and that's why I stack silver. Anyways, of course, what he is prescribing is complete and utter madness. At some point, this con game is going to collapse, and the rest of the world is going to say a big, fat, resounding no to the United States dollar. Why should they continue to use a currency that is becoming extremely unstable and that is constantly being manipulated? And when the rest of the world rejects the U.S. dollar, the value of the dollar will drop like a rock because there will be far less global demand for it. In addition, if the rest of the world is not using the U.S. dollar for trade any longer, other nations will cease to soak up our excess currency, and huge mountains of our currency that are floating around out there will start flooding back to our shores. At that point, we will be looking at inflation unlike anything we have ever seen before. The era of cheap imports will be over, and we will pay far more for everything from oil to foreign-made plastic trinkets that we buy at Walmart. Most Americans don't even know what a reserve currency is, but when the U.S. dollar loses reserve currency status, it is going to unleash a nightmare that most economists cannot even imagine. So enjoy this holiday season while you can. There are still lots of cheap imports filling the shelves of our stores. Once the coming giant currency superstorm strikes, we will dearly wish for the good old days of 2012. And yes, the dollar is alive and ticking for now, but at the pace that our authorities are abusing it, I would not say that things are looking good for a long and healthy lifespan. Going back to the article from Paul Krugman of the New York Times, we have our own currency. We can print the stuff, so there's no risk that America will default on its debt. So, and then he immediately goes on to say, well, there'd be no risk if it wasn't for those evil Republicans. Like there's actually a difference between them and the Democrats. That's funny, Paul. But he totally, okay, first, the government does not print the money, as most of you are aware. If you're a new listener, look that up. Federal Reserve, not a government entity. They're a private entity. Maybe I can call myself Federal Ryan, and then I can start making my own money and back it on gold and silver. I don't know. But apparently, he says our government makes the money, which to me takes a huge cut out of what's going on in our real economy out because, hey, never mind the fact that the Federal Reserve prints the United States money at interest and loans it to the American government. And then that's where our all-loving income tax comes in to pay that debt down, right? Because America can't print their own money. They need a private central bank to do it for them. And then that's where you and I, the cattle, the sheep, that's where we come in with our hard-earned wages that are attacked through inflation and also taxed through the illegal, unconstitutional IRS, taking your hard-earned income tax money to pay back the Fed. Now, Paul's not talking anything about that. He's just saying we can print our way out into eternity and out of oblivion. We can do that. And the only thing that would stop this economy from recovering and getting better is the Republicans. I mean, is he... People believe this. I guess that's why I'm laughing. Paul, really, guy? And I know Paul's not listening to this. He's probably like watching Anderson Cooper in his new Oprah talk show or something. But really, guy? I mean, come on. American people, come on. Stop looking at this stuff, huh? Or if you do, at least try to look at it from a real perspective.